It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. This week, new Covid rules for England are voted through with Labour support.
The measures before the House today will fortify our national defences and guard the gains that we've all made against this deadly virus.
We believe these measures are necessary to protect ourselves, necessary to protect the ones we love, and necessary to protect our NHS.
But Boris Johnson suffers the biggest rebellion of his premiership.
It's unthinkable that every autumn from now on we will be limiting the quality of life for all citizens just to be on the safe side.
I believe that no government should ever use fear as a tool to try and persuade its citizens, and that is what's happened.
At PMQs, Keir Starmer questions Boris Johnson's leadership.
Will the Prime Minister take time this Christmas to look in the mirror and ask himself whether he has the trust and authority to lead this country?
We vaccinate, they vacillate. They jabber, we jab.
And in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon advises people to limit their social contacts over Christmas.
My key request today is this: before and immediately after Christmas, please minimise your social mixing with other households as much as you can.
People will struggle to understand why it is safe to mix with 400 people at a concert, but not 4 families in their own home.
Well, as we heard there in the headlines, it's been a very dramatic week in Westminster. Boris Johnson did get his new Covid restrictions through the House, but in the process he suffered a huge rebellion from his own backbenchers. Susan, how did the week unfold?
Well, the background, of course, are these soaring cases of this new variant Omicron. It's amazing, isn't it? We hadn't heard of it just a few weeks ago, and now it's dominating everything. So the government had already decided it needed to bring in some new restrictions for England, really to bring it in line with other parts of the UK. So that was things like mask wearing, more controversially, a kind of Covid pass. So you'd need to show that you'd had a negative test or were vaccinated to get into big events like football matches. There's going to be a debate and vote on that on the Tuesday. However, we've seen throughout the pandemic, Conservative MPs in particular making louder and louder complaints about the extra curbs on people's freedoms. And that, I think, has probably been made even more sharply focused after all those stories that the Inner Circle and Downing Street had perhaps not been keeping to all of the rules in the past with those parties, alleged parties, last year. However, Labour did support the government in bringing in new restrictions, but the Health Secretary had a bit less help from his own side.
Scientists have never seen a COVID-19 variant that's capable of spreading so rapidly. So we have to look at what we can do to slow Omicron's advance.
Does he accept that the government's mixed messaging has been incredibly unhelpful, telling people that a tsunami of Omicron is on the way, but at the same time we can go on partying? Absolutely undermines that message. Will he have the moral courage to say that we actually do need to reduce our social contacts?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think what we need to do are the measures that are in front of the House today, and I hope the House will support those.
Can I say to him that a vaccine passport with a lateral flow test alternative is still a vaccine passport? We have seen the use of vaccine passports in other parts of the country, in Scotland and in Wales. So can he tell the House what difference it has made to the transmission of Omicron in these parts of the country.
This is not a vaccine passport. I mean, the right honourable gentleman should know that a vaccine, if he wants to see a vaccine passport, he will know of that in Scotland, or he can go to France or some other countries. The regulations we're debating today are not measures that any of us would like to be putting in place, but they are measures that I think the situation demands, because when the facts change, our response must change too. As we look ahead to a winter with Omicron in the midst, the measures before the House today will fortify our national defences and guard the gains that we've all made against this deadly virus.
In light of comments made in recent days by at least one Conservative MP comparing these measures to the situation in Germany in the 1930s, I would just say it should not be for me, as the Shadow Secretary of State, to point out that we are not living in the 1930s and the Secretary of State and his team are not Nazis. We believe these measures are necessary, a necessary response to the Omicron threat, necessary to protect ourselves, necessary to protect the ones we love, and necessary to protect our NHS.
Covid will be with us for many years to come, and it's unthinkable that every autumn from now on we will be limiting the quality of life for all citizens just to be on the safe side. And justifying our new illiberal rules on the basis that they're less authoritarian than those of other countries is truly appalling. That is not our culture, that is not our history. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a slippery slope down which I do not want to slip. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be supporting these measures.
The last 2 weeks, the ghost of Christmas past has appeared, and he brings with him fear and uncertainty. We cannot continue to flip and flop and change tack. We cannot continue to terrify people. I am staggered by the government's approach over the last 2 weeks, in which we have used fear to persuade people. I believe that no government should ever use fear as a tool to try and persuade its citizens, and that is what's happened.
Do we really care about the freedoms that we all took for granted before 2020? Now, I know people roll their eyes when Conservatives and Libertarians start talking about civil liberties and freedoms. But freedom is not an abstract ideology. Freedom is what enables my constituents to see their family, to comfort the dying, to go to school, to go to work. That is what freedom looks like.
Well, Susan, as you were saying, difficulties there for Sajid Javid on his own side from those interventions. After that debate, the measures were voted on. What happened?
Well, they all got through because, as I was saying, Labour did back them. But we did see substantial rebellions on every one of the votes from Conservatives. And one of them, actually 100 of them rebelled. That's more than a quarter of the Parliamentary Party. And that was also after the Prime Minister himself had done the rounds of the tea rooms trying to persuade people. So I think that will have come as a shock that the rebellions were quite as big as that.
And at PMQs, the final one, of course, of 2021, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was keen to question the Prime Minister's leadership.
Yeah, I mean, a rebellion of that size is usually very damaging to a Prime Minister. Now, Boris Johnson, you can't always predict. It's not normal. He often defies the normal political mores and political gravity even. However, as you might imagine, opposition MPs and the opposition leaders did home in on this question of leadership, because if a Prime Minister can't lead, and they only do it because their own MPs back them as leader, if they can't lead, well, what's the point of a Prime Minister?
Can I take this opportunity to make clear to the Prime Minister that if further votes are needed to save lives and protect the NHS, Labour MPs will follow my leadership and we will always put the national interest first. Can I ask the Prime Minister to get his house in order so he can say the same about the members behind him?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, if further measures are needed, as the House will understand, if further regulation is needed, of course this House will have a further say. As for following his leadership, Mr. Speaker, they wibbled-wobbled over Plan B, they wibble-wobbled over quarantine, and if we listened to him, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't even have the vaccine rollout, because we would have remained in the European Medicines Agency.
Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary is so weak that without Labour votes last night, vital public health measures wouldn't have got through. But this country can't... Says it's not true. Oh, God. I haven't got... It's not true. He's so socially distant from the truth. He thinks that that's not true. I don't know where to start. We better press on. We can't go on with a Prime Minister who's too weak to lead. So will the Prime Minister take time this Christmas to look in the mirror and ask himself whether he has the trust and authority to lead this country?
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We won that vote last night with Conservative votes, as I told the House. I respect the feelings and I respect the anxieties that colleagues have about. Of course, I do. I respect and understand the anxieties, the legitimate anxieties that colleagues have about restrictions on their liberty. But I believe, and on the liberty of people. But I believe that the approach that we're taking is balanced and proportionate and right for this country. We vaccinate, they vacillate. They jabber, we jab. They play party politics, Mr. Speaker, and we get on with the job.
A Prime Minister who can't do what is needed to protect the public is no Prime Minister at all. Mr. Speaker, nobody wants further restrictions, but Scotland can't afford to be hamstrung if the Prime Minister can't act because he's got 99 problems behind him. So will he give the devolved governments the powers and financial support that we need to protect our people?
Mr. Speaker, I think we're going to need a bit bigger waistcoat to contain the synthetic indignation of the right honourable gentleman, quite frankly. If I can just tell him that there are the powers. The Scottish administration has the powers. But what we've also done, Mr. Speaker, is a record settlement, for Scotland, £41 billion. But I, in all friendship with the right honourable gentleman, who I'm actually quite cordial with behind the scenes, Mr. Speaker, we will work with the Scottish Government to make sure that we get through this thing together.
Susan, Ian Blackford, they're asking Boris Johnson about extra support for the economy. That's because we've seen empty bars and empty restaurants as people make decisions about pre-Christmas plans. That could become an increasingly big issue, couldn't it?
Yes, I think that is the next place this is going, as people take the warning seriously and say, well, maybe I won't go for that Christmas party. And we've seen Labour as well and the Treasury Committee, cross-party Treasury Committee, calling for more support for business. I mean, so far the government's been holding out and pointing to the support that's still in place from the last lockdowns. But I wonder if the pressure, particularly at this time of year, because the run-up to Christmas is so important for the hospitality industry, and they will say that, well, you've not closed us down, you've basically put a missile through our business, and we will see quite a clamour from all quarters for more help.
And later in the week, Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England, was setting out some of the scientific evidence to a committee of MPs. What did he say?
Yes, of course, it was Chris Whitty who rather set the ball rolling with this suggestion that you should cut down on your socialising in the run-up to Christmas and over Christmas. And that was something he reiterated, doubled down on when he appeared before the committee and talked again about a huge spike that he's expecting shortly in the number of cases, and was quite open about the fact that he didn't know how that would translate into hospitalisations. However, even although there's been quite a bit of pushback from Conservative MPs about what he's been saying about not socialising too much, he does have one quite important person who's taken his advice, who's the Queen, who seems to have cancelled her Christmas lunch. However, let's have a look at what he was saying to the MPs.
What I'm advising people to do is to prioritise. If the most important thing to them in the next 10 days is to go to a football match, that's the priority for them. That's really the point I was trying to make. But prioritise the things that really matter to you, but don't. But if you wish to do those things and wish to do so and not end up self-isolating or unwell at a time you really don't want to be, then you're probably going to want to do fewer other things.
So if you were planning in the next week to go to, I don't know, 4 or 5 social functions, your advice would be try not to go to perhaps the 2 or 3 that matter least to you.
Well, certainly, I mean, it would obviously depend what other social... Basically, what I'm saying is that anybody who has something that really matters to them, concentrate on that thing and then build out from there. I think what we will see with this, and I think we're seeing it in South Africa, is that the upswing will be incredibly fast, even if people are taking more cautious actions as they are. That will help slow it down, but it's still going to be very fast. It'll probably therefore peak really quite fast. My anticipation is it may then come down faster than previous peaks, but I wouldn't want to say that for sure. I'm just saying that that is a possibility. But in terms of where we're going over the next couple of weeks, the rate of increase is going to be, I think, fairly impressive.
Chris Whitty answering questions there from Jeremy Hunt, amongst others. Thank you for now, Susan. We'll be back with you in a few minutes' time. But let's go to the Scottish Parliament, where COVID-19 and the response to the Omicron variant has also been, unsurprisingly, the big issue this week. Our correspondent Andrew Kerr is there. Hello to you, Andrew. As we heard in the headlines, we got a significant statement from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, setting out the Scottish Government's latest thinking. What did she say?
Yes, that's right, Jo. The real focus has been on Omicron, on that variant, the focus of the people, this Parliament and indeed the government. So last week, the First Minister was warning about a potential tsunami of infections. So then this week, a very important statement from Nicola Sturgeon. And I think there was a real fear earlier in the week from people, would Christmas be cancelled? Well, it wasn't cancelled, thankfully, but there are some new restrictions, including guidance. No more than 3 households can meet at a time. But it won't apply on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, or Boxing Day, or whenever a family or people have their main festive celebration. Now, also, there are further restrictions on shops and hospitality to make sure that social distance is maintained. In a moment, we'll hear from the Lib Dems and their reaction to this. But first of all, let's hear from Nicola Sturgeon setting out some of these new restrictions.
We are asking everyone, and we will issue strong guidance to this effect, to cut down as far as possible the number of people outside our own households that we are interacting with just now. This will help break transmission chains. So my key request today is this: before and immediately after Christmas, please minimise your social mixing with other households as much as you can. However, if you do plan on socialising, either at home or in indoor public places, we are asking that you limit the number of households represented in your group to a maximum of 3 and make sure you test before you go. I know this is a tough thing to ask people to do, especially at this time of year.
Nobody wants to surrender the progress that we have all made over the last 18 months. But at moments like this, at times of crisis, we need clarity from the government. We need businesses to get support, pound for pound, and we need both the Scottish and UK governments to work together. People will struggle to understand why it is safe to mix with 400 people at a concert, but not 4 families in their own home. The effect of this public uncertainty will see the event sector rocked and events cancelled.
Now, Jo, Alex Coe-Hamilton also brought up the fact that a rave was going to be held at the site of a vaccination centre in Edinburgh. But the First Minister made it clear that that had indeed been cancelled. Now, the government didn't pick up that point directly, just about the inherent contradictions that we seem to be seeing in some of this advice. We're being told to limit household contact, but of course nightclubs are still open. But I think the point that is being made is that this is not a perfect situation. It's not a black and white situation, but I think the government are keen for more restrictions if they did indeed have that funding.
Well, as you say, at the moment it is still guidance, but we got some key details this week about the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry in terms of who will be leading it and what it will focus on. What did we learn?
Yes, that's right, Jo. So, of course, we learned from the Prime Minister who will chair the COVID-19 public inquiry in England, and then the COVID Recovery Secretary John Swinney made a statement to Parliament and saying that the inquiry here would be chaired by Lady Poole, a judge. Now, John Swinney was saying that the government would cooperate fully with that inquiry and it would be ready to begin its work in the new year. Now, there are 12 separate areas of reference that they will be looking into, and these include pre-pandemic planning, the decision to enter lockdown, and how COVID was dealt with in care homes. In a second, we'll be hearing from Labour asking about non-COVID health impacts and the inquiry and how it might focus on that. But first of all, let's hear from the Deputy First Minister.
Presiding Officer, today I am announcing to Parliament the establishment of a statutory inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 to examine the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland. At the outset of this statement, I acknowledge that COVID-19 has had and continues to have an enormous damaging impact on our society. And most painful of all, COVID-19 has led to significant loss of life, resulting in heartache to all those who have lost loved ones. We remember all those who have lost their lives, and I express my sympathy to those who mourn their loss. I hope this inquiry will help to provide the answers for which these individuals search.
So can the Deputy First Minister confirm that item H of the remit will encompass looking at whether decisions to cancel cancer screening programmes, delays in diagnosis and the cancellation of operations that perhaps contributed to this higher than normal death toll amongst the population will be fully considered?
At the heart of the handling of COVID has been the Four Harms framework. It was a policy development which I led within government to recognise the fact that there are no easy choices to be made in the handling of the COVID pandemic, and I acknowledge there have been significant implications for other health services as a consequence of the prioritisation of COVID care. Sadly, that is what happens when a global pandemic comes upon us. But the inquiry will be able to consider and to reflect all of that thinking in what has been a very broad remit that has been given to the inquiry, and obviously Lady Poole will be able to reflect on all of these questions.
John Swinney saying it'll be wide-ranging in its remit there. Andrew, later in the week, COVID-19 continued to be a big issue in a slightly different way. The Scottish Conservative leader wanted to look at the vaccine rollout and also the impact all this is having on businesses. What happened?
Yes, that's right, Joe. On First Minister's questions, of course, Nicola Sturgeon requested extra time just before that rather stormy statement just to speak about the danger of the variant and its rapid spread. Already, as we've been hearing, there has been quite an argument already about what money should be coming from the UK Treasury. The Scottish Government is wanting funds to compensate companies and businesses for tighter restrictions that they would like to see. So the First Minister was saying she was wanting to request an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister because she was saying there's a danger of sleepwalking into an emergency, because there's a real concern the new variant is actually spreading faster than the booster programme can actually keep up. And that led to this question from the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross.
People vaccinated today are not immediately protected against the virus. That's why on these benches we have been calling for the reintroduction of these mass vaccination centres for weeks. If the Scottish Government had acted when we first called for them, twice in COVID statements in November, at FMQs 2 weeks ago, we would be further along the road than we are at the moment. And although the new variant has meant necessary changes to guidance, it's not right that once again businesses are still waiting to hear what they need to do to comply with the First Minister's statement from Tuesday. She was right to say earlier on, this will have a massive impact on businesses.
Omicron is doubling every 2 to 3 days in Scotland. In parts of the UK, the doubling time is currently less than 2 days. It will be the dominant strain by tomorrow, I expect, in Scotland. It has an R number that some assessments say is above 4. We do not have time to waste. We don't have time to waste on vaccination, but we don't have time to waste on putting in place the protective measures that will help slow this down. Lives, again, are at risk here. Livelihoods are at risk and the NHS is at risk. And that's why, yes, the government's got to speed up vaccination, but all of us have to come together to do what is required to slow this down. And the UK government has to step up and provide the financial support that businesses need.
So the arguments continue about funding, and the leaders were also arguing about the timing of new restrictions of the guidelines coming in and how that might affect businesses, of course concerned about the financial impact. Now, we spoke earlier about the fear that Christmas was being cancelled. It isn't for now, but of course there's one more week until Parliament here rises for the Christmas recess. Now, the First Minister has another statement to make to Parliament on Tuesday, so all eyes will be on that, just on the latest COVID situation. Jo.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's Andrew Kerr there at Holyrood. Let's return to Westminster, catch up with Susan Hume on a different story, because it hasn't all been about COVID in the Commons this week. We've had the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, setting out some proposals to reform the Human Rights Act. It's been talked about a lot. What did he say this time?
Yes, if the government's feeling a wee bit unpopular with its own side, reforming the Human Rights Act is perhaps a way to win back a little bit of love from them. The Human Rights Act was brought in more than 20 years ago by the then Labour government, and it's based on the European Convention on Human Rights, which was agreed by countries after the Second World War. It's all to do with making sure that individuals have their rights against public bodies and the way they're treated by public bodies. However, although it's nothing to do with the EU, some critics feel that it gives too much of a lead towards European law compared with British law, and Dominic Raab has said that he would like to redraw the balance in that.
This government's proposals for a Bill of Rights will strengthen this country's proud tradition of freedom. It will curtail abuses of the human rights system, and it will reinforce the democratic prerogatives of elected members in this House over the legislative process with respect to the expansion of human rights. And above all, we will restore some common sense to the system. Under our proposals, we can prevent serious criminals from relying on Article 8, the right to family life, to frustrate their deportation from this country. Like, just to give one example, the case law is littered with them, of the convicted drug dealer, also convicted of battery against his partner, someone who paid no child maintenance, but who nonetheless claimed the right to family life to trump the public interest in his removal.
Every time the government's in trouble politically, they wheel out reforming the Human Rights Act. It's a dead cat distraction tactic by a government that doesn't know how to fix the criminal justice system that they've broken and is desperate to divert attention away from the corruption scandals they started. This is little more than an attempt to wage culture wars because they've surrendered from waging war on crime and corruption.
It really does take some brass neck for this government to invoke a history of upholding human rights, coming as this state does hot in the heels of multiple dreadful pieces of legislation designed to absolutely trash those rights, whether it be the policing bill, the elections bill, the judicial review bill, or most appallingly the nationality and borders bill.
Susan, what's going to happen next with these proposals?
What happens immediately is a 3-month consultation with a view to drawing up a British Bill of Rights, though I'm bound to say that that is something that people have looked at before and has sort of been languishing in the too difficult box, but we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Susan, for now. Let's return to the issue of COVID-19, because that's also been a key focus this week in the Welsh Parliament, which has been sitting virtually to try and limit the spread of the virus. Our reporter, Cemlyn Davis, is there. Hello, Cemlyn. Members have been debating the Welsh vaccine booster programme this week. What were they focusing on?
Yes, that's right. And at the start of the week, the First Minister announced that the Welsh Government is aiming now to ensure that all adults in Wales have at least been offered an appointment for a booster jab by the end of the year. It's a big undertaking, and all available NHS staff are being redeployed to help out with the effort. Health workers are also being asked to cancel their Christmas leave. But there remain big questions about how all this will be delivered, as we heard here on Tuesday when the Health Minister faced questions on this.
The message is to get your booster and make that your priority. But for many people across Wales, that's not particularly the issue because they're ready. They're ready to get their booster. I think the question is how they can do that. And for many people, despite the messaging that it's a priority, it's a case of sit and wait.
Vaccination is absolutely the priority now. And if we do want to protect our NHS going into January in particular, then now is the time to do that work. And that's why we have really put a turbocharger up our system to make sure that that vaccination programme can actually just be rolled out much quicker but not in the chaotic way that we've seen in England. So in Wales, we do things differently. We try and line things up before making an announcement. You saw those scenes in England on the weekend. Thousands of people rolling up to vaccination centres, no plan, GPs hadn't even been told. We do things very differently here in Wales.
Well, she's talking about chaos in England, and I saw the same pictures. I hear about chaos here in Wales, where people turning up to vaccination centres are being turned away because they have an appointment in January, whilst other people who hadn't received an appointment yet, because they are less of priority, are allowed to walk in and receive their booster. That doesn't make a great deal of sense.
So as we heard there, some confusion over whether people can just turn up to get their jab. The Welsh Government's position on this is that people should wait to be contacted, although there will be a walk-in facility for certain priority cohorts. But what we're hearing is that certainly in some parts of Wales, people from younger age groups and less priority groups have also been able to just turn up for a jab. So the opposition parties calling for clarification around that.
Kemlyn, we talked earlier about the Scottish COVID-19 inquiry. There have been renewed calls this week for a Welsh inquiry into the pandemic and its handling. What's happened?
Yes, and this has been a long-running row here in Wales. For several months now, the opposition parties and bereaved families as well have been calling for a Wales-specific COVID inquiry to look at the way the pandemic has been handled here. But the First Minister has long insisted that only a UK-wide inquiry can put the decisions taken here in Wales in their full context. That said, Mark Drakeford has also signalled that if it becomes clear the UK-wide inquiry won't give Wales due attention, then he could reconsider. Well, the Welsh Conservatives brought a fresh debate on all this on Wednesday.
It is high time that this Welsh Government stopped playing party politics, Llywydd, with writing various letters to Number 10 and got on with announcing what they should have done months ago, that they will in fact hold a Wales-only inquiry. Wales wants answers.
This debate need not be an ugly exercise in point scoring about what happened under horrendous circumstances, but there were processes that didn't make sense last year, failures that led to deaths, families, including mine, that lost loved ones living in care homes. It is not a comfortable thing to be raising, but not raising it and not seeking to do everything possible to learn from what happened would be a catastrophic mistake.
It was even more sad when I met with the bereaved families for Justice Cymru in the Senedd last month. And their desperate pleas for answers was once again highlighted and underlined by so many heartbreaking stories of personal loss, grief and hardship. So let me be clear, through its unwavering support of a four-nation inquiry by the UK government, the Welsh government is actually denying the Welsh public answers on decisions that it took, and it took alone.
The broad context for our decision-making has been inextricably linked to the consideration of the wider UK science and policy landscape. For example, SAGE advice, the UK Chief Medical Officers Network, Treasury, and UK government support measures, they've all set the parameters within which decisions made in Wales by the Welsh Government have been reached.
Well, the Welsh Conservatives' motion calling for a Wales-specific COVID inquiry was backed by all the opposition parties, and so it only failed because of the presiding officer's casting vote. In accordance with the rules, she had to vote against it. Now, on this issue, I mentioned earlier that Mark Drakeford is waiting to see that the UK-wide inquiry will give Wales due attention. One of the tests he had set the UK government to show how serious it is about including the devolved administrations in the inquiry process was for the Welsh government to be consulted on the appointment of a chair for that UK-wide inquiry, rather than simply finding out about it via the press. Well, as we heard earlier, a chair for that UK-wide inquiry has now been appointed, and it transpires that the Welsh government was told told about that in advance. The First Minister also says that he's received further assurances that Welsh ministers will be involved in the drawing up of the terms of reference of that UK-wide inquiry. And so he'll be hoping that all that will ease the concerns that many people have in Wales, that Wales will simply be a footnote in the UK-wide COVID inquiry.
Thank you for bringing us up to date on that. Cemlyn Davis there at the Welsh Parliament. Let's go to the Northern Ireland Assembly now and catch up with our reporter Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, COVID passes or certificates have been a big talking point here in Westminster this week and also in Stormont. How did the debate come about there?
Yes, Joe, this is a quirk of Stormont. We had the law put in place a couple of weeks ago, and then just this week we've had the debate. Essentially now, if you go to a pub, a restaurant, a cinema or a theatre in Northern Ireland, you need to produce your COVID cert or prove that you have a negative test. It's a much broader law than will apply in England. The Health Minister, Robin Swan, had previously suggested this was something we didn't need, but he now says it's a measure whose time has come. And he's been backed by 4 of the 5 executive parties, his own, the Ulster Unionists, the SDLP, Sinn Féin, have all backed it, including Alliance. But the DUP have opposed the measure. And Pam Cameron, who's the Deputy Chair of the Health Committee, pushed the Minister and wanted to know why the policy focus has shifted from one of encouragement to one of threat.
The Minister needs to tell this House today how this policy is going to be monitored in terms of its effectiveness. He also needs to tell us what modelling has been done and what it shows in terms of impact on hospital admission cases, deaths as a result of this policy. To me, the introduction of vaccine passports indicates the Minister and the Department have admitted that they have lost the argument with those hesitant to take the vaccine. The carrot has turned to stick.
The objective behind the COVID status certificates is to allow the public that confidence to walk into the establishment and to know that that's a safe place. The purpose is to try to keep their doors open, and that's what we're committed to doing.
That was the point of the Executive's autumn-winter plan, which actually set out a number of steps that would be considered when the point was necessary to do that. And it says in that plan that was when infection numbers in Northern Ireland were rising or additional pressures on our hospitals. We were seeing those numbers starting to rise. We expect them now with Omicron actually to rise further in the number of weeks ahead. And I know the First Minister talks about the storm that is coming. Mr. Speaker, you're better preparing for a storm when it's not raining, rather than waiting till you're up to your knees in the water. And that's what some of the purpose of these regulations, as part of a wider package, actually intends to do.
Now, there were some last-minute changes to the legislation, which meant that these certificates have to be checked when people enter premises, rather than perhaps if you're in a restaurant when you sit down at the table. And the hospitality industry has said that's caused them more problems, and also coupled with the fact that customer numbers are falling because of Omicron and worries around that. They're now talking about the issue of financial support. So this is an issue which hasn't gone away.
No, Jim, let's look at something else. Members have also been looking at a bill that would have changed the law on abortion in Northern Ireland. What's the background to this?
Well, this is a bill that was proposed by the DUP, an amendment essentially to abortion law here that would have restricted abortion in cases of non-fatal disability. And abortion has always been a controversial issue here in Northern Ireland. The 1967 Act, which brought abortion in across the UK, never applied here in Northern Ireland. And it's only in recent years, after a number of court cases at a local, national and even international level, that the UK government said it would move to legislate for abortion services here in Northern Ireland if Stormont didn't. So in 2019, when Stormont was still in a form of suspension, the law was brought in at Westminster. And this move proposed by the DUP would then just have restricted that in certain circumstances. And it's not something that they were alone on. A number of other parties, or at least members within parties, have their own objections to abortion. But many members have in fact changed their position over the last couple of years. And here's Michelle O'Neill, the Sinn Féin Deputy First Minister, explaining why she couldn't support the DUP bill.
This is about having a rights-based society. A society where we uphold the rights and entitlements of everyone, regardless of whether they fit your own personal beliefs or not. This is about trusting women. This is about trusting women as those who are best placed to take decisions about our own pregnancies in conjunction with our own medical healthcare professionals. We've had enough. We've had enough of women being exiled abroad. We have enough of women taking abortion pills, often on their own and without medical supervision. This is the moment to draw the line.
We have always, and we will always, continue to support women who have spoken out, the women who have suffered in silence, those who have worked hard to end the shame on abortion, the campaigners who have openly flouted and broken the law on abortion. And if this bill or any of its clauses pass, I will continue to support them and I will continue to stand with them, because this bill will bring us right back to needing to take those actions.
I would suggest that if we do not change the law, the message that we're sending is clear and simple to understand, that people with Downs or other non-fatal disabilities are less valuable to society, and as such, they deserve less protection in the law. That's the current situation. So if members opt to maintain such a situation, it is my very strongly held view that that is the message that we will be sending out.
Now, when the DUP first proposed this bill, it was thought that perhaps it would receive majority support here at Stormont. But as I say, a number of members have changed their position. There was some careful lobbying by a number of interest groups to persuade them not to support this bill, and indeed it was defeated 45 votes to 42.
Powerful debate there, though. Thank you very much, Jim. That's Jim Fitzpatrick there for us in Belfast at Stormont. Let's return to Susan Hume here in Westminster, because we've got time to bring you one more story from the House of Commons. An interesting one. In fact, the Defence, not that the others haven't been interesting, of course, the Defence Committee took evidence from the astronaut Major Tim Peake. He was talking about possible defence and security issues that could crop up in space. What did he say?
Yes, well, a bit of stardust in the Defence Committee for a change with Tim Peake there. He was worried about a very serious issue. Last month, the Russians fired an anti-satellite missile at one of their own satellites, to see if it would work. And it really did. It blew the satellite up. It smashed and exploded into about 1,500 bits, which were all whizzing around, to the extent that the astronauts in the International Space Station had to take cover in capsules because of this sort of storm of bits of debris. And of course, there's already a lot of debris whizzing around in space, which is a problem, increasing problem for communication systems. And the Americans have called that missile test dangerous and irresponsible, and Tim Peake very much agreed.
We were shocked about that recent Russian anti-satellite test, and in particular I think the recklessness of introducing so much space debris into an orbit at 485 kilometres, which means that it is above the International Space Station. It's in an area where it will impact for a number of years various different orbits and also launch capabilities. So I think what it represents is obviously something that is not in accord with the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is to avoid polluting space as an environment and avoid introducing debris into that environment. And so it does make it more difficult when we're looking at trying to establish international norms and behaviours as we move forward into an area where space is becoming ever more congested and contested.
Major Tim Peake. Susan, it's the last edition of the programme for 2021. When is Parliament returning?
That's right. They've packed up now until Wednesday, the 5th of January, so they'll be back just in time for Prime Minister's questions, unless there is a recall of Parliament for any other COVID regulations. Pretty unlikely. I think the government would want to avoid that where possible, but it is a possibility.
Thank you, Susan. That's all for this week. And as I said, this has been the last Politics UK of this year. But we're back on air on Friday, the 7th of January, to bring you all the key parliamentary highlights. Until then, have a very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy New Year. Bye-bye.